Catholic social doctrine began in response to a new anthropological and political creed, man and citizen, that swept from France to the rest of Europe and to her former colonies. This creed considered the human person in two ways. First, as a natural datum, having liberties which had been obscured or even broken by the historical social order. Second, the human person was considered as a citizen, standing equally among other citizens before the state. On this model, fraternity was associated preeminently, if not exclusively, with citizenship. Other social memberships were deemed legitimate only insofar as they were the private choice of individuals, or insofar as they were permitted or conceded by the state. Catholic thinkers, both clerical and lay, quickly targeted the ideal of fraternity as the most troubling part of this new creed. For example, Cardinal Chiaramonti, the future Pope Pius VII, who was later kidnapped and held in solitary confinement by Napoleon, put on his letterhead when he was the Archbishop of Imola, "Liberty, equality, and peace in our Lord Jesus Christ." Throughout the 19th century, Catholic thinkers attempted to identify what Joseph de Maistre called the sacred perimeter. That is, social domains having a sacred solidarity not reducible to citizenship. That is, orders both higher and lower than the state. Probably the best document, Catholic document of the 19th century in this regard, to identify sacral orders higher and lower, were the Advent sermons of 1848 by Bishop Emanuel von Kettler. They became the model for much of what the Roman magisterium would do later. After 1860, when the Roman magisterium began to develop in some serious way a body of social teachings, it followed suit. First, it took a scissors-like approach to the state, limiting and contextualizing citizenship according to higher and lower social orders. Second, it tended invariably to sacralize these higher and lower orders. While adjustments in detail were made during the era of totalitarianism in the 20th century, this basic scissors-like approach remained intact throughout the 20th century. Now, I don't intend this afternoon to rehearse all of the historical details of this tradition. Rather, I raise a question that emerges from within the tradition. Do social entities exist unto the image and likeness of God? And even today, well, especially today, this is a disputed issue within Catholic theology. And it's not easy to reach a clean and unambiguous verdict. For one thing, although the question first emerged within the context of social doctrine, it bestrides sacramental theology, ecclesiology, Christology, and theological anthropology. My purpose this afternoon is not to resolve the problem, but only to mark out some major moments in the evolution and the current disposition of the question. First, brief definition of some terms. Within the Catholic tradition, generally, imago, a copy, similitudo, a likeness or perfection, imitatio, a representation, a simulatio, similarity in form, a conformatio, a constitutional character, and vestigium, a trace, are theological terms of art. Since Leo XIII, magisterial documents rely chiefly upon Thomas Aquinas' understanding of sacral imaging or imitation. Since the Second Vatican Council, however, this neo-Thomistic tradition has had a much looser grip over the subject. While the scholastic terms are usually the best place to begin, they do not necessarily indicate where this discussion ends. Even so, some things are commonly taught. Imago pertains in an unqualified sense to Christ, who is the eternal and consubstantial image of the Father. In the case of the created human person, who is an imperfect likeness, the proper description is drawn from sacred scripture. ad imaginum et similitudinem Dei, unto the image and likeness of God. The preposition indicates that the imprinted image in the human person is not one in being with its source. Thus, imago in man can be predicated of man only by an analogy of proportion. What proportion? The proportion signified by imago is not just any created effect, but a likeness in species, or a likeness in some mark of a species. Nothing, of course, participates directly by way of species or nature in divinity, except for the divine persons. The human person, as a participated likeness, is, by analogy, an image of God through acts of knowledge and love, which are at the root of human nature. Again, it's by analogy, which signifies dissimilarity in distance as well. Just as the principle of unity and dignity in the created image are marked by knowledge and love, so divine acts of knowledge and love mark the unity and dignity of the thing imaged. Traditionally, this has been called the image of representation. That is, a pattern of knowledge and love that manifests from afar the likeness of divinity. Minimally, it can be taken to mean that the human capacity or aptitude for God as a first principle of being and goodness is some kind of an imitation, generically, the self-transcending nature of the human soul's spiritual operations. It's also commonly taught that although human reason, untutored by faith, can detect within itself and in other human persons something divine-like in the operations of knowledge and love, the notion that the created person is an analog, a created analog of a trinity of divine persons, can be grasped only by faith. As Augustine said, and as Thomas repeats, we see a trinity within ourselves, but we believe a trinity in the Godhead. Traditionally, this is called image of conformity, that is, by conformity to grace. By adoption, the human person is made a player, a participant, or a communicant in the communion of divine persons. We grasp not only a Trinitarian image that was there inchoately by nature, but obscured by sin, we also glimpse something of the community of divine persons in Christ's members, who in a sacred solidarity exercise faith, hope, and charity. Finally, it is commonly taught that the term similitudo, or likeness, can mean two things. A likeness can be something more general than an image. All creatures have a certain likeness to God without being an image. Similitudo can mean also the perfection of an image. The likeness of an image is more perfect by acquisition or infusion of certain habits. The perfection, whether by nature or grace, is not merely in the capacities to know and love, but in the habitual operations or actions of the person. As I understand it traditionally, image falls directly under theological anthropology and Christology, while likeness, if we mean by likeness a perfection of the image, falls under moral and sacramental theology, both of which pertain to actions perfecting the image, chiefly actions in conformity to grace, but not excluding perfections derived from action in accord with the natural law and the acquired virtues. Now, having compressed into a few paragraphs several books of theology and having bulldozed over many other distinctions, I present to you the following question. Can image and likeness be predicated of a society? If we mean that the image and likeness consists in an accumulation of social relations, the answer is clearly no, at least for the Catholic tradition. Augustine and Aquinas reject, for example, the idea that Adam is not image until Eve, and that neither are images until the child. Professor O'Callaghan already referred to this, a kind of Mormon understanding of this. As late as the Second Vatican Council, believe it or not, 1964, in the debate over the notion of the image of God in Gaudium et Spes, the sociological trinity came back up, amazingly enough, and it was decisively knocked down. Made unto the image of God, the human person is, according to St. John Damascene, an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement. This dignity is sacral because the soul is directly created by and ordered to God. The primary relation, therefore, is the created image entirely to its entire Trinitarian exemplar, not the created image to another created image. Moreover, a human social order does not have the unity of substance, and therefore it would seem incapable of being imago in the strict sense of the term. If we are to speak of a social icon or image, we need some real principle of unity. For where there is no unity, there is nothing to bear the image of the exemplary divine unity. This has always been the strongest reason for not predicating image of a unity that consists entirely of social relations. Now, Leo XIII and his successors, especially Pius XI, fashioned a solution to this problem in two steps. First, they appropriated Aristotle's understanding of a social unity of order and grafted it on to Pseudo-Dionysius' formula that the good is self-diffusive. This step provided a general natural law framework for understanding the sacral imaging of social orders, at least insofar as the individual image acquires the perfection of similitude by being rightly ordered in a social body. Second, Leo and his successors turned to sacramental theology in order to show how some social orders, namely marriage and church, are directly and properly called images. Let's briefly consider the first step. A unity of order stands between unity of substance, a man, a bird, a plant, and a unity of mere aggregation, a heap of sand or a queue waiting for the tram. In a social unity of order, a marriage, a family, a college, or a church, each individual retains his own identity and operations, yet the social whole is more than the sum of its parts. It counts as a subject, person, and agent in its own right. It has a unity based not in rational substance, but in rational order. Lawyers and philosophers called this kind of entity a moral person, or a legal person, or even a mystical body. A social entity has not only a common end, but also an intrinsic common good. Thomas called it communicatio in forma, a shared form that marks its distinctive kind of union in common action. In this case, the form is nothing other than the order. Form of order distinguishes a society from other kinds of intersubjectivity. A crowd at the shopping mall or an audience at the opera exhibit intersubjectivity without pursuing a common end through united action. Partners, for their part, pool their resources for the purpose of increasing profit. But such pooling does not necessarily require common action, and its proximate end is the private yield cashed out to each partner, rather than the enjoyment of an indivisible common good. So when the social magisterium speaks of, quote unquote, a true society, a recurrent expression in the documents, it means two or more persons communicating in a common good that cannot be distributed or cashed out. The common good never exists as a private good, and therefore when someone exits a marriage or a polity or a church, he cannot take away his private share. Courts understand perfectly well that they can divide and distribute the external properties, but not the marriage itself. You can't send one spouse off with 38% of the marriage. Wherever you have two or more people communicating in something that cannot be distributed in that way, you have some kind of a society that has a principle of unity, although not one of substance. A common good is never distributable in a quantitative sense. It is not distributable in itself. In the case of a divorce, therefore, the matrimonial society is not redistributed so much as simply dissolved or annulled. So we take the example of a queue in front of a credit union. The individuals are the parts of the queue, partners in the credit union, but members of St. Rita's Parish. To be sure, human persons related as parts and as partners exhibit sociability and intersubjectivity, but it's only in their relation as members that it's possible to speak of a society. A social union, as John Paul II insisted, is something more than alter apud alteram, that is, a side-by-side intersubjectivity. It will always enjoy a common good, a form of reciprocal action that's intrinsically valuable to its members. Now, Leo XIII and his successors, this is right at the time Durkheim is writing. Okay. I think they knew nothing of social science at that point. In fact, I can't find the word social science showing up until the 1930s, and it was not used favorably when it showed up in the 1930s. They were Catholics, so what else did they do? They went to something really old. They took this Aristotelian rubric of a social unity of order and grafted it on to something only a little less old, namely the Dionysian principle. That is to say, they imitated just what Thomas seemed to have been doing. Creatures imitate God in a twofold manner. First, insofar as each creature has its own perfection in the order of substance. Second, insofar as creatures cause good in others. Thus the famous dictum, bonum sui diffusivum est. The good is diffusive of itself. The greater good, the more it's communicable and shareable. So Leo and his student, Pius XI, were very keen on this Dionysian formula, and both of them used it frequently to explain the sacred dignity of social orders. Here, one example will suffice. In the first year of his pontificate, 1878, Leo XIII issued a letter on the problem of socialism. It's called Quod Apostolici Muneris. Now, I just know that jaws had to have been agape when they read, in 1878, the Bishop of Rome, in the heyday of the class warfare and everything, issuing a critique of socialism based on Pseudo-Dionysius. On the question of whether diversity and inequality have a social purpose, Leo writes, "For he who created and governs all things has in his wise providence appointed that the things which are lowest should attain their ends by those which are intermediate, and again, these by the highest. Thus, even in the kingdom of heaven, he hath willed that the choirs of angels be distinct, and some subject to others, and also in the church. He has instituted various orders and a diversity of offices, so that all are not apostles or doctors or pastors. So also he has appointed that there should be various orders in civil society, differing in dignity, rights, and power, whereby the state, like the church, should be one body consisting of many members, some nobler than others, but all necessary to each other and solicitous, communicating in a common good." Unquote. Now, Leo is here paraphrasing Thomas. We know this because there's a footnote. And here's Thomas's. This is from Commentary on the Sentences. To my knowledge, his first ever use of the term natural law. Quote, "God wished to produce his works in likeness to himself, as far as possible, in order that they may be perfect and that he may be known through them. Hence, that he might be portrayed in his works, not only as according to what he is in himself, but also according as he acts on others. He laid this natural law upon all things, that last things should be reduced and perfected by middle things, and middle things by the first, as Dionysius says." Unquote. So, what exists simply in God is communicated to creatures in a multiform manner. Thus, it's a double imitation or portrayal. First, a diversity of created things, each having a good according to its participated being. Second, a diversity of created things imitating God insofar as they cause good in others, in effect, insofar as they bring into existence, through their own secondary causality, additional modes of participation among themselves and others. The superabundance of what exists in God simply is in creation most perfectly expressed in a varied manifold. Charity perfects a social principle that's embedded in the creation of angels and men. And that principle is this: one loves the good not only as it is possessed and owned, but even more as it abides and is poured forth and communicated. Unquote. Now, according to the exhortation of Ephesians 5:1, be ye imitators of God, the intellective creature loves the good precisely as it's communicated to many. That is, as it's made common. And without a unity of order, we would have only isolated individual things, each having the good of its own being, but all together portraying nothing more than a quantitative accumulation. So against socialism and liberalism, Leo insisted that the natural law requires both the preservation of the individual good and the pouring forth of the good in social relations. The double limitation can also be considered in light of the Trinity. In the Trinity, a community of persons communicate in a common form. As the ancient creeds put it, the persons are consubstantial. According to Revelation, this is a sui generis case of relations which are not accidental but substantial. In the creature, however, communication in a substantial form would obliterate the individuals and remove the ability to cause good in others. Therefore, creaturely imitation of God exhibits two forms which cannot be confused or absolutely separated. Each form represents something of the Trinitarian unity. The creature possesses, imperfectly and from afar, a likeness of image in the order of substantial form, in the unity of the soul's operations, as well as an additional perfection or similitude insofar as he or she communicates with others in a social form. Thus, two different but correlative ideas of unity and good. As Thomas said, quote, the creature is like God in unity inasmuch as each creature is one in itself, and all together are one by unity of order, unquote. How did this kind of theological reflection emerge in modern times in Catholic social doctrine? It was the problem of the modern state that was the occasion for it. What would be missing from the world if the state reduced all dignities to individuals and to a single homogeneous social form of citizenship? Leo contended, outrageously, it would seem to me, it would be like angels without choirs. Angels without choirs, isolated entities which in one sense bear the divine image, but lack a diversity communicating in a social form whereby gifts are given and received. Society, Leo said in Rerum Novarum, cannot be reduced to one dead level without destroying society. It was audacious in 1878 to pull Dionysius' treatise on angelic hierarchy out of the hat to respond to socialism. And even more generally, Leo and his successors were advancing an argument for normative social pluralism based upon social imitation of God rather than society as a mere aggregate built up out of individual rights. Recall that in Genesis, the individual acts of creation are deemed good, one by one, yet the hexameral acts are crowned by the relation of Adam and Eve. This order is deemed very good because something new is brought into existence, not another substance, but a unity of order whereby persons, through action, cause good in one another. This diffusion of the good in human persons from the beginning is marked by a social union, namely marriage, which is a type of the church. As Augustine said, all creation is for the sake of the church. Now, while Leo and Pius XI sometimes use the term imago of this new relation, more often they use the term similitudo. Recall, similitudo can mean the perfection of an image. So the human person is made unto the image and likeness of God, first as regards the soul and its operations, and second, sub specie societatis. In short, social unions are the perfection of the image, even according to natural law. By suppressing and homogenizing social relationships other than citizenship, the modern state was at war with the sacred order of things. Insofar as the modern state permitted the existence of other social entities only by concession in the pattern of state sovereignty, the state was implicitly claiming to be the exemplary cause of the good. Social entities were, in effect, icons or copies of the state. So you must understand how widely and deeply Catholic thinkers since 1789 depicted the modern state as a neo-pagan expression of sovereignty, not just a divinely instituted agent of punishment, but a rival of God. As for liberalism, the social magisterium typically complained that the second prong of the Dionysian formula is either denied or obscured. Diffusion of the good for liberalism is only an aggregate result ensuing upon self-interested action, that is, it's the hidden hand of the market. This model preserves perhaps the dignity of the individual in the abstract, but does not affirm, at the very least, the perfection of the image on natural law grounds. So if the totalized state is a demonic rival to the divinity, the liberal state is a demonic rival to the diffusion of the good via social relations which image, however inchoately, the divine Trinity. Now, I have to say a few things about the transition from the general pattern of imitating God, sub specie societatis, by being in social relations, to a more specific one in specie sacramenti, that is, with respect to the sacramental image. Leo XIII's Arcanum Divinae, 1880, and Pius XI's Casti Connubii, 1930, were the two most important teachings on matrimony since the time of Trent. Leo and Pius contended with state laws on civil marriage and divorce which were driven by the proposition that by nature, marriage is only a collaboration intersubjectively for the purpose of reproduction. Matrimony, on this model, has no fixed, or what Leo called insculpted, form. Therefore, the form of the union is entirely a creature of the state's law, either by way of direct imposition by the state, or by what the law allows individuals to impose upon their relationship. Most Catholics, in fact, today, do not appreciate that it was the sexual and matrimonial issues, right, that really started to drive this issue very early on. It's not difficult to appreciate why the social form of matrimony was of chief interest to Catholics. For without an insculpted form, marriage cannot be a natural sign of the union of Christ and the Church. In short, marriage could not be sacramental. Citing Thomas, Pius XI contended that marriage is not merely a consent to the joining of bodies with a reproductive end in view. Rather, marriage is a consent to a union upon which ensue the ends. Marriage is not a free-floating set of ends or purposes, but rather ends brought about through a specific mode of union. And they quote Thomas, quote, "Nor is the direct object of consent a husband, but union with a husband on the part of the wife, even as it is the union with a wife on the part of the husband," unquote. Psychologically, of course, one desires or chooses this man or woman. It could also be true that one has in view a mutually agreeable end, such as reproduction, or economic security of the family, or whatever. But it is the consent to the union that participates the societal form and deserves to be called marriage. The other intentions, to consent to this man or this woman, and to consent to a common end, can obtain in the absence of matrimony. Indeed, partnerships of various kinds, including partnerships which create a common pool of resources, will often entail a consensus, this person rather than that person, for such and such an end without implying consent to any kind of societal union. Pius XI, working these very texts, writes that while the begetting and education of children are first in the order of ends, they are not first in the matter of the form that makes matrimony. Quote, this mutual molding, interior conformatio, he says, of husband and wife, this determined effort to perfect each other, can, in a real sense, as the Roman Catechism teaches, be said to be the chief reason and purpose of matrimony, provided that matrimony be looked at not in the restricted sense as instituted for the proper conception and education of the child, but more widely as a conformity for the entirety of life. He argues that marriage depends upon generous surrender of his own person made to another for an entire span of life. That's where John Paul II got that logic of the gift. He pulls it out of Casti Connubii. It's not his phenomenology that he picked up in the 40s and the 50s. It's lifted right out of Casti. So, Pius urges that marriage is more sacred than the state. It has a greater claim to being derived from God as a copy. It has a greater claim to being a community of persons, indivisibly, for the whole of life. And it has, as it were, a greater natural density of unity and form. But it's more sacred for another reason. Matrimony is also the natural fundament of the sacrament, the sign of the unity of Christ in the Church. In the case of marriage, the material sign is already a social union. It is the only one of the traditional 7 sacraments that has social unity of order as its natural sign. Okay. By grace, this social union is called Imago Christi. Pius XI calls it a living image, an efficacious and mystical image of the whole Christ, head and members. Importantly, Pius insists that the husband and wife bear the image by reciprocation. You can't be the Imago Christi, image of union of Christ in the Church, just by being Bob or just by being Sue. They're going to have to do something together to constitute that image. It has to be done together. And at least under the sacrament, neither the husband and the wife alone are the image. It's the union that's the image, and that's exactly what's being consented to. So here we have at least one instance by the 1930s laid out very clear of a social entity that's not just the perfection of an image, but the bearer of an image. We should not be surprised the Catholic social doctrine so regularly and insistently turned to this issue of matrimony. It was not in the first place a question of moral theology. Rather, it was the original case of a social union, precisely as a society bearing the dignity of Imago, and not just any sacral image, but from a theological standpoint, the plutonium grade image, namely Imago Christi. And it depends upon the integrity of its natural sign, which is nothing other than marriage itself. And this is why the legal, political, and philosophical conflict between the modern state and the Church over marriage and divorce was intimately related, both to social doctrine and to sacramental theology. Okay, 2 things are in place. I'm going to spin the reel ahead historically. Into the 1940s, we find these 2 principles in magisterial teaching. According to the Dionysian principle, individual rational creatures are made unto the image of God, and they exhibit a perfection of that image insofar as they're members in various social orders. Even on this generic, natural understanding of the human person as image, one that's somewhat naive of the exact Trinitarian image, the person imitates God by causing good in others, and this is called similitudo. Number 2, marriage, however, is a social unity that not only fits the Dionysian formula, but enjoys a special status. Although it's in one sense lower than the state, in another sense it is, as Pius asserted, more sacred than the state, for its social form is not only directly instituted by God, but is also a natural sign of Christ's social body. Here the social form is called Imago. The conformatio of spouses is a sign of Christ whose incarnation was not merely an incorporatio, God taking flesh, but a concorporatio, the establishment by grace of a social body. And it's this social body, the whole Christ, head and members, which can be called Imago Christi. These two steps having been taken, roughly between 1878 and 1948, we can move directly to the opening pages of Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Church. Here we read that the ecclesial union is to be called sacrament. In fact, the idea that the church is a sacramental image is presented so quickly that one might think that it's either a pure assertion or that the argument had already been made somewhere. Indeed, it had been made by Pius XII in Mystici Corporis, 1943. Writing in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, Pius set out to explain why the primary mission of the church is to be Christ's social body, and therefore to be a sign of the unity of the human race. In Mystici, Pius gives a rather thorough survey of the different ways that a social unity transcends the sum of its parts without destruction of its members. The church, he notes, shares many of these predicates. The church, like any other kind of society, is a unity of order that does not destroy individual members. It enjoys an intrinsic common good, it has functional organicity, and so forth. But unlike other societies, the mystical body of Christ has no identity other than being Christ's social body. In the case of marriage, as I just said, we can speak of a natural form that achieves a higher unity by the habilitation of grace. For its part, the church has no identity other than being grafted onto and conformed to its head. It has no form other than the actions of its members through the outpouring of charity, the ordering of the Holy Spirit, and sacramental actions. Were the church only a social and juridical unity, like a college or a club, it would be a social entity of some sort, but it would not be the church, even if it still shows up in the yellow pages. So Pius XII writes that by sanctifying grace, we are conformed to the image of the Son of God and renewed according to the image of Him who created us. But, he goes on to argue, it is the will of Jesus Christ that the whole body of the church, no less than the individual members, should resemble Him. Precisely as a society, he insists, the church is Christ's social body expressing both exterior and interior, the most faithful image of Christ, unquote. Citing Bellarmine and Gregory of Nyssa, Pius insists that the church is a person. And if we had to look that person up in the yellow pages, it's called Christ. The whole Christ, the head and his social body. So the surprising thing at Vatican II was not Lumen Gentium, which just completed this paean encyclical on the church as the social Imago Christi. Rather, the surprising issue was tucked inside of Gaudium et Spes, where the council treats the natural dignity of the individual simply as Imago Dei. Early drafts had emphasized Genesis 1, male and female, he created them. Some bishops wanted to say that the social relation is, by creation, not just by grace, a fundamental aspect of the Imago, not just a similitude. Other bishops, however, worried that if the Imago is predicated of the relation, it would imply that the human person receives the Imago from relation to others who are not God. The issue of the sociological trinity came back up. This would not only stumble into the heresy that holds that the image is assembled through social relationships, it would also mislead and derogate from the dignity of the individual, under attack in modern times. Remember, in 1965, the totalitarian regimes, or at least some of them, are still in place. So here we are over in the doctrine of the church, using social Imago language like all get out. And here we are now in Gaudium et Spes on the church in the modern world, and they're scared to use it. So they compromise. Here's how the relevant section of Gaudium et Spes 24 reads in its final form. Indeed, the Lord Jesus Christ, when he prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one, opened up vistas closed to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness, the term is similitudo, reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself, unquote. In other words, what the council did in this document is they took from Casti Connubii Pius XI's description of matrimonial society as a mutual gift, and then they spliced it together with Christ's prayer for the church's union and the order of grace. Interestingly, rather than dealing straight on with the question of the natural condition of the Imago in the order of creation, they quote authoritative texts which pertain to how, in the order of grace, matrimony and church are imagines Christi. The social aspect of the image of God seems to be derived entirely from the New Covenant, without the natural fundament drawn from Genesis and Ephesians 5. The great sacramentum, as Paul says, the creation of the union of man and woman as to bear the image of Christ in the church. Leaving out Genesis, male and female, and moving directly to John 17, which they did in order to avoid the sociological imago of man meets woman, have child issue, something was missing. It seems that the social aspect of the image of God is constituted entirely by grace, which is, of course, not quite right on the traditional reading of Genesis 1:26 and Ephesians 5. My last part. Upon his election in 1878, John Paul II made a beeline for Gaudium et Spes 24. There's nothing he wrote about more than Gaudium et Spes 24. I'm quoting the Pope. The Second Vatican Council, in speaking of the likeness of God, uses extremely significant terms. It refers not only to the divine image and likeness which every human being as such already possesses, but also and primarily, verum etiam et praesertum, to a certain similarity between the union of the divine persons and the union of God's children in truth and love, unquote. Now, Gaudium et Spes 24 did not say primarily. I think the council was trying to say something closer to also. But for John Paul II, the issue of the primarily has to be taken back to Genesis. That is, to the very passages that Gaudium et Spes 24 sidestepped. The Pope argued that Adam's solitude, mythically represented in Genesis 2, confirms the notion that the individual person is the bearer of a divine-like dignity. He's alone because he's face-to-face before God. In Genesis, of course, Adamic solitude is resolved by God, who puts him into a deep sleep, from which the original Adam awakes, male and female. Adam's solitude is addressed not by assimilation to another natural substance, nor by the creation of a new substance, but by communio personarum, a sexually differentiated community of persons. And as we know, it was not exactly a shotgun marriage, for Adam gives his song of consent to the union. But what's important for our purposes is the conclusion that John Paul II draws from this. Quote, and this is the one that's made it really a disputed issue. Quote, if we wish to draw also from the narrative of the Yahwist text the concept of the image of God, we can then deduce that man became the image and likeness of God not only through his own humanity, but also through the communion of persons which man and woman form right from the beginning. The function of the image is to reflect the one who is the model, to reproduce its own prototype. Man becomes the image of God not so much in the moment of solitude as in the moment of communion, unquote. There's a lot more we could cite from this literature of Wojtyła. Now, maybe this is only a deepening of the Dionysian formula of the double imitation. If we take this line of interpretation, what John Paul II seemed to be saying is that first, maybe not temporally first, but first, there is the individual created image. Okay. Second, there is a union of the two, a perfection of the image. So, even before the question of diffusing the good through procreative action, Adam recognizes the good of the union. Adam said, now is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Wherefore a man shall leave father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be two in one flesh. The sexually differentiated persons complete one another. This agrees in essentials with the Dionysian picture. An individual is perfected as a member in a union with others by performing acts of giving and receiving. Thus, a traditional picture, the image and its similitude, its perfection. In fact, JP2 refers quite a lot to the Dionysian principles in his various writings. He calls it the double subjectivity of the image. The human creature, he says, images the Trinity in his own subjectivity and as a member of a social subjectivity. It is in the nature of the image to diffuse the good through the reciprocity of the gift, to use his language. From the beginning, therefore, society is proto-sacramental. By the way, it would be tedious to cite all of the times he says this throughout his magisterium, his teaching magisterium. On the other hand, it certainly seems that John Paul II asserts a kind of relational ontology of the created imago that Gaudium et Spes 24 hesitated to affirm. And it seems that developments in ecclesiology, from Mystici Corporis through Lumen Christi, and in sacramental theology, especially the sacramental theology pertaining to marriage, have clearly insisted that the Church and sacramental marriage should be called imagines Christi. What's the disputed issue? The disputed issue is not whether sacramental marriage and the Church are to be called images of Christ. It's the natural law status of the image. It goes back to the male and female he created them. Okay. It looked as though John Paul II, seeing how we have social orders higher and lower than the state that are both sacral in the plutonium sense of sacral, that is, images of Christ, wanted to go back and lift up the status of the natural image. In any case, it was the issue was obscured enough by this point that the International Theological Commission for 2 years studied the disputed issue, and in 2003 submitted to Cardinal Ratzinger, president of the commission, a document entitled Communion and Stewardship, Human Persons Created in the Image of God. Referring to Genesis 1:27, the commission states, God placed the first human beings in relation to one another, each with a partner of the other sex. According to this conception, man is not an isolated individual, but a person, an essentially relational being, and fundamentally relational character of the Imago Dei itself constitutes its ontological structure, unquote. That looks to go well beyond similitudo at this point, at least on my reading. The Commission rejected any sort of dualism that would vest the image only in the psychological capacities, in exclusion to the human body, apropos of what Professor O'Callaghan was talking about. And it denied any sort of monism that would vest the image only in the actualization of the individual. The Commission, therefore, affirmed what seems to me to be the stronger interpretation, the Trinitarian and relational structure of the created imago. The Commission concludes, the created image affirmed by the Old Testament is, according to the New Testament, to be completed in the Imago Christi. In the New Testament development of this theme, two distinct elements emerge: the Christological and Trinitarian character of the Imago Dei, and the role of sacramental mediation in the formation of the Imago Christi. It takes marriage to be the chief instance of this. So this is sort of where the issue stands today. There are two social bodies which deserve the predicate imago: marriage, sacramental marriage, and church. But even natural marriage seems to be now proto-sacramental. In the order of grace, they are called Imago Christi, precisely as a social union. Both are higher and more sacred than the state. And as this line of thought has developed over the course of the last century, the magisterium has tended to circle back and reconsider the individual imago as it exists by nature. Accordingly, the social character of the imago, even by nature, was constantly being upgraded, issuing finally in the teaching that the social relation is not merely a similitude of perfection, but is inherent to the image, not just as an accident to a substance. I will not claim that this is a theology that's been rendered tidy and harmonious in every respect. And I think there's more than a few questions that need to be considered much more carefully. But it has now become the spine of Catholic social doctrine, from what I can tell. All of Benedict XVI's three encyclicals not just mention or cite, but emphasize this aspect of the Imago. In Deus Caritas Es, he goes so far, Benedict, as to say, the Church's social doctrine is nothing other than sacramental mysticism, quote unquote. That's where it seems to stand. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you.